The Blast from Our Past Network.
Hey everyone, co-host Corey here. I just wanted to take a quick second and say thank you to all of our Patreon supporters. Without you, Podcasting After Dark would not be possible. If you would like to help the show grow, please consider signing up at patreon.com/podcastingafterdark. You can also support the show by purchasing one of our awesome t-shirt designs on our merch store at podcastingafterdark.com, or by picking up a copy of 7 Winters Alone by David Irons on paperback, hardback, or Kindle. Just search for 7 Winters Alone on Amazon or click on the link in the show notes. A free way to help out is to leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Those reviews are huge for us and really helps get the show in front of new listeners. Again, thank you all so much for the love and support you've given us over these past few years. It really means the world to us.
Podcasting After Dark presents TV Obscura, a deep dive into underrated and unknown television shows from our youth. Cartoons, sitcoms, cop shows, and much more. Sit back and enjoy some nostalgic fun with TV Obscura.
Oh yeah, brother! Welcome to the yearly wrestling episode of Podcasting After Dark presents TV Obscura. That's right, brother, I'm 1/3 of the TV Obscura team. Sleazy C, aka Corey, joined with me as always is the snack, the total snackage Schaefer Zach, and the Armageddon Diallo Jackson. And this year, we are going to be talking about some crazy wrestling events. First up, brother, we're going to be talking about when the madness meets the mania, Saturday Night Main Event 1987, brother. Oh, yeah. Then we're going to be going into the War Games at WCW WrestleWar 1991. And then lastly, we're going to be talking about the tragedy of the Shockmaster. Woo! Guys, I have a new appreciation for what those guys and gals do up on stage, because I did that for probably, when it gets trimmed down, for a minute and a half, and I could feel my fucking vocal cords about to be fried. How the fuck does like Randy Savage, R.I.P., and Hulk Hogan back in the day, like maintain that level of intensity for like minutes on end, like maybe up to like 5 to 10 minutes? It's fucking insane. Anyways, guys and gals, as I said, if you understood me at all, this is our annual wrestling episode, because we like to do it close to WrestleMania, because Zach and Diallo are huge wrestling fans, and through osmosis, I am as well. Guys, how excited are you for WrestleMania this year, 2023? Diallo, can we talk about WrestleMania really quick? What's the big, match this year? Who's the big matchup? Does anyone know?
You have to ask Zach. I have zero idea. I know what Roman Reigns is fighting, and that's it. I don't really catch up with it as much as I used to, and I kind of like osmosis, like you just said. I kind of get it through Zach when he talks about it. Like when something's coming up, he'll talk about it, and I'm like, ooh, but I don't watch it like I religiously did back in the day.
Back in the 80s and the 90s. Okay, so Zach, throwing the same question to you, my friend. What's WrestleMania this year looking like?
Well, I tapped in about a month ago to watch Royal Rumble to kind of get my feet wet again on the current storylines, because like Diallo, I don't really watch the current product as much as I used to. However, and it's topical because it connects with one of our stories tonight, the American Dream, Dusty Rhodes, baby, his son Cody Rhodes is taking on Roman Reigns, who is the son of Sika, who popped up in another one of our episodes tonight. That's the big main event for WrestleMania. John Cena, he actually is going to make another wrestling appearance. He's going to wrestle in a match against a dude that is Austin Aries. That's a guy who's not worth his weight in gold, in my opinion.
Are we going to be able to see him?
So, yeah, we will be able to see him and his he's made it very obvious. Actually, his latest promo he did against this guy Austin Aries. No, it's not Austin Aries. Austin Theory, that's his name. Yeah. I said Austin Aries. Sorry. Austin Aries is not his opponent. That guy's a legit wrestler in his own right. Austin Theory, who's not worth his weight in gold, in my opinion. I'm not a fan of his. But yeah, John Cena will be making a WrestleMania appearance, and so will his bald spot. And I only say that because he called it out himself in the latest promo on Monday Night Raw a couple weeks ago. It's gold. It's really funny. Like, he tore this guy down. And Diallo, when a veteran shoots on a younger guy and makes him look like a tool bag in front of the audience, that's not always a good thing for the new guy. So, so he's in Austin. Speaking of Austin, Stone Cold Steve Austin may wrestle this year as well, potentially, because WrestleMania is in Los Angeles, so there's a rumor about that. There's a bunch of other, undercard matches that are decent. Trish Stratus is going to be wrestling again.
Holy
Trish
crap.
the Dish. Yep. Yeah, she's going to be in a 6-man with Lita and Becky Lynch, who does a great Cyndi Lauper impersonation on the Rock TV show, sitcom. Anyways, WrestleMania is now a 2-night event. It used to be 1. I think that's changed over, right before the pandemic. I think it switched to 2 nights, or during the pandemic. I forget when.
Well, so I know you used to have wrestling parties. Do you still have them?
Well, yeah,
WrestleMania parties, I should say.
I'm going to have one on Saturday, and Diallo, of course, you're invited. We have plans Sunday, but we'll at least watch Saturday night. And I used to give out prizes and all sorts of stuff.
Yeah, I still have my my belt and everything that I think I won at one of yours. But my question was, so which one do you have a party for if you can only have a party for one? Like, what is the main match? Is it Saturdays or is it Sundays?
They haven't announced the full lineup as of this recording yet. So I don't know whether it's going to be Saturday or Sunday. I really want to see the Cody Rhodes Roman Reigns match. I think it'll be a decent match, and Roman Reigns is a good heel. For all you non-wrestling fans, he's a bad guy. And Cody Rhodes being... he's got a great story, and the whole gimmick that they're running with right now is that he's carried, his father, Dusty Rhodes, who was a champion in the NWA, never got the WWF title because he was relegated to polka dots, and as Diallo definitely knows all that whole backstory, he never got the big match, right? Because he wasn't Vince's guy. So Cody Rhodes is coming back. He came back and, might fulfill his father's destiny, his father's dream, so to speak.
And Cody Rhodes
His American
is not...
dream.
Yes.
Yeah, good call. And Cody Rhodes is not Goldust, correct? They're different.
He's not. Dustin Runnels, a.k.a. Dustin Rhodes, is Goldust, and he wrestles in AEW part-time. Like, he's in his late 40s, early 50s now, I think.
But they're related, right?
They're brothers, yeah.
Oh, okay.
They're brothers.
Okay.
I think there's 3. They've got a sister as well.
Okay.
But yeah, Cody and then Dustin may come up in this discussion as well when he was the natural Dustin Rhodes.
Well, we certainly have a lot to talk about, but I do want to get all of our listeners, especially the new listeners, up to speed as to where our level of fandom sort of lies. We did a wrestling episode last year. We called it out then that this is going to be an annual thing because all 3 of us enjoy wrestling to some degree, and we talked about it then, but I again just want to sort of set the stage for where we're all coming from. For me, I grew up always surrounded. My closest friends have always been into wrestling. I would never sort of watch it on my own, but I would have absolutely no problem watching it with other people. Like, I wouldn't want to change the channel or anything. I'm down to watch it when I'm with other people, but I never sort of followed it on my own. And I've had people in my life, my entire life, that have been into wrestling. So I have knowledge throughout wrestling from the 80s up until now, probably a little bit more, probably the 80s and 90s, I have probably a bit more. But thanks to Zach, I still have a bit more knowledge nowadays. But that's why I say through osmosis, because that's where my fandom has always been sort of tertiary, sort of attached to somebody else type of thing. But I've always enjoyed it. Diallo, where's your peaks and your valleys of wrestling? Like when did you start? What's your peak? When did you sort of phase out of it and everything?
I think I first kind of discovered it like early 80s, but it was where I grew up, AWA used to come on. And I would watch that, but not really religiously. It was just something that kind of came on Saturdays, and I would casually watch it. And then, you know, I started to see like Hulk Hogan showing up with Cyndi Lauper at the Grammys and that kind of stuff, and I knew that all that stuff was going on. I remember watching Rocky 3, so I knew who all the wrestlers were, and Junkyard Dog and blah blah blah. Cartoon came on, I would watch it a little bit, but then there was I think I've talked about it before, there was the Magical Day. I think I'd been watching Galaxy High, and it was a rerun that day, so I flipped the channel, and it was wrestling, and it was the day I think I literally almost turned it right when it was Piper's Pit and Hogan, Andre turned on Hogan, and I just remember my mind being blown, and I was just like, from that moment I was just like so into it. So that was like 87, I think, and then from about 87 till like the early 90s. Like really early 90s, like 90, 91, I was pretty religious about watching it. I went away to college and I just couldn't watch it, so I only got to see it like in the summertime. And then kind of faded away, but I always paid attention. But then in the mid-90s, when New World Order started popping, I got back into it, and I watched all of that go on. Faded away again. But then one of my friends watched it a lot, so that was right. It was right around the time when Stone Cold and The Rock and stuff were coming back, so I would watch it with him a lot. And then after that, I haven't really watched it very much since then, like the early 2000s. But then meeting Zach and watching going over and watching some events and stuff, I see he introduced me to CM Punk, and so I kind of got into that era a little bit. And was Kofi what's his name, Kingston?
Yeah, Kofi Kingston.
Yeah, Kingston, and that crew I started to watch a little bit, but yeah, I don't necessarily watch anymore. I listen to a lot of shoot videos and descriptions of stuff that actually happened back in the era that I used to watch. Jim Cornette has a podcast, and he tells a bunch of stories, and so I listen to that stuff a lot, just kind of like that, like this is what actually happened part. So that's kind of where I'm with it now.
So a real roller coaster for you, kind of like ups and downs throughout your entire life, pretty much. And you mentioned the mid-90s era of wrestling. That's probably the closest I've ever gotten to me personally being actively into it. Because one of my things back in the 80s was I'd go over to Luke's house or something on the weekends and watch it with him. But back in the day, remember, it was like a name guy versus a no-name jobber, and that's how every match was. And then the 90s happened. It's kind of like when I repaid attention, I'm like, every match is amazing because every match is a guy, a name versus a name. And I kind of liked that. But yeah, Zach, what's yours has pretty much been the same your entire life, right? Pretty solid.
Pretty solid. I mean, I've only up until recently kind of tapped out on wrestling, just because I felt like the pandemic is what changed it for me. But my love started, I think, when my mom bought me the Remco AWA action figures back in the day, and because they were the same size as He-Man guys, and I started getting into pro wrestling that way. I would see the clamshell boxes at the video store of, the original War Games matches back in the early 80s, Starrcade, the early WrestleManias 1 and 2, and then WrestleMania 3 obviously was my big gateway into the explosion of loving wrestling, watching the storylines building up on superstars on the weekend like Diallo would watch. And but then I would watch, the other territories like NWA, AWA, WCCW, UWF, Florida Championship Wrestling, because those would be on syndicated networks like TV 44 in the Bay Area, or Channel 26, right? Diallo, was that another channel in the Bay
Channel
Area?
26 had there was like a super obscure one that was called I think it was a CMC Wrestling or something. I might be saying the music video channel, but they used to have like a super obscure wrestling promotion on 26 as well.
Yeah, they did, and I think ESPN also aired like AWA and USWF and like all these different smaller territories that eventually got absorbed by the WWF, later WWE. So yeah, I mean, I ate, breathed, and slept wrestling, much to the chagrin of like alienating friends at school that weren't into wrestling like I was. Watching pay-per-views by myself, or having people come over and they're like, "This is stupid." I'm like, "Then why are you here?" So
people really said
but
that
I
to
never.
you?
I had some friends come over like, "This is so lame," and I'm like, "Then why are you here?" Like, you knew what this was. This is a wrestling party.
You had lame
Sean
friends,
Dunn,
man.
yeah. I know, dude. I know. I have some friends. Dean is a guy who listens to the show religiously, and he's always chiming in like, "I'm so sorry you went through that." I'm like, "It's okay, man. I got through it."
I have never had anything but 100% of a blast of a time at any wrestling party I've ever been to, any pay-per-view I've ever been to. When I watch wrestling with my friends, I always have a damn good time. I don't know how you can't have a good time.
Well, I will say, wrestling was my best friend when I was a kid.
Oh,
it was
my
really
God.
Yeah, it was really the thing that I immersed
No, not something you should announce.
I mean, it was like, it was like, guys, how you are with comic books, where you just the comic books were always there. They never let you down. Wrestling was always there. It never let me down. It's okay. No, but
It's real to me, damn it.
Yeah, I mean, on one level, I can totally relate to those dudes, because it's like I was full on immersed. And so now my love is passing it down to my son, but also the historical lore. Like Diallo and I he'd come over and we watched the documentaries that they made of these guys. And that's the more fascinating stuff now to me than what the product is currently on television. I still watch it from time to time, like WrestleMania I'll watch this year. But yeah, I mean, I grew up eating and sleeping and breathing that stuff. I just love it. I love it.
And so for this episode, so last year we covered a cartoon, the Rockin' Wrestling cartoon. We covered Tag Team, right? And then we covered, what was that comedy, the sitcom? Learning the Ropes.
Learning the Ropes.
Yeah. So we kind of like danced around wrestling itself, like wrestling proper. So for this year, we kind of put our heads together and, well, first off, the guys, Zach and Diallo, they come up with something a bit more, focused and everything. Me, I'm trying to figure out what to contribute, and I've always been sort of fascinated by the Shockmaster thing because it was funny as hell. But, I started learning the backstory about, Fred Ottman and everything, and I'm like, I started to actually like him because he seems like a nice guy. But I'm going to be talking about the Shockmaster because there's not much I can really bring to the table, but I can discuss the things that these guys are going to discuss because we all watched the same thing on Peacock. So Diallo's going to be up first, and he's going to be talking Saturday night's main event, which first aired October 3rd, 1987. And this is the event where basically Honky Tonk Man versus Randy Savage, and then kind of teams up, and then Hulk kind of comes out and everything. It's kind of a bit more not so obscure, but at the same time, because we were throwing things out, it's obscure to me. So I'm looking at this from a completely noob's point of view. So the fun thing is, everything's on Peacock, so I was able to actually watch this, and so I can actually discuss it. And then Zach's going to be talking about the War Games, specific segment War Games at the WCW WrestleWar 1991. So we're not going to be talking about the whole event for either of them, although I'm sure parts outside those matches will come up. Because Diallo, we are going to be talking about Pile Driver for sure. And of course, we're going to be talking Diallo about the Macho Man and Hulk post-match promo set that when I saw it, I was like, oh my God, I know this promo set like the back of my hand because it's become like sort of a meme and everything. So
Yeah.
I'm excited to dive into all of these things. Super excited. So Diallo, can you tee up, why you want to talk about this match, and then, take us right into it and everything you want to talk about this this Saturday night main event.
Yeah, so behind the scenes, I was waffling a lot about what I wanted to talk about. So I could have talked about a billion different things, and I actually probably have a lot more respect, say, for like the NWA era of wrestling and wrestlers, but it was like, I told you, just on a personal level, it was actually really hard for me to watch NWA wrestling when I was growing up, because where I lived, it only came on like on the San Jose TV station, and we could only get that signal at nighttime, clear enough for me to watch it. On the weekends I would get to watch it, and then there was a channel called TV 58 that had some more NWA stuff, and that was one that, like, it came on, it was like really snowy. So anyways, I used to record the WWF ones, but I would watch them over and over and over again. But the NWA wrestling, I would just watch it that one time, and I'd probably never seen them again, even though I remember all the instances and stuff from it. So it was a little bit harder for me to say. But anyways, this particular moment, I think, has a great impact. It had like on me kind of emotionally, and as well as, I think, like when I look at like the history of wrestling and like the ups and downs and stuff, this was like a pivotal moment for not just like the WWF, but for wrestling as a whole. So just to kind of like tee up, in the context of it, was like maybe a year or two prior, Macho Man had been the Intercontinental Champion. He lost the belt to Ricky Steamboat at WrestleMania 3, which to me is still one of the greatest matches in the history of wrestling. And then like maybe like a week or two later, a month later, Ricky Steamboat dropped the title to Honky Tonk Man. And the Honky Tonk Man was like the most hated. Like, he was a great heel. Like watching this again, yes. It was like, I was like, oh man, he's so good, like at being like bad guy. And he had the belt for a long time. Like, it was like over a year. Yeah. He held the belt, which was crazy. And so Macho Man had started to like, he had always been a heel, but he was sort of like, for me, he was the precursor of what wrestling was going to become a decade later, where he still, like, he never started to be like a face, but people were cheering for him and liking him, right?
Can I ask a noob question? Was that not common before Randy Savage? Meaning, is Randy Savage one of the first heels that kind of rose into such high popularity?
Yeah, like in the WWF anyways, yeah. It's like,
yeah.
And that's why, like, I like the NWA and like later the WCW, I think when the WCW figured it out, they kind of went with their strengths, and which was kind of what Macho Man had been, where it's like people like different people, doesn't necessarily matter if they're good, a face or a heel. So Macho Man was like a heel, but like people, like, he just had the heat, right? And so, but he didn't necessarily like start acting like a good guy per se. But in that moment, in that match, he was trying to get back the Intercontinental title, and it just like, he still was in that like gray space. Like, obviously he was going against like the biggest heel of them all, but he still wasn't like on the side of the Angels at that point. And there was like some slow things that they did. Like, he used to like go to the ring and Elizabeth would like trail him, but then all of a sudden she started to go in front of him. So it was and he'd like bend the ropes to let her in. So there was like little visual stuff like that to show that he was like kind of softening a little bit, but he still had that edge, you know? So, so that was like the precursor up to that match. He wasn't necessarily a good guy, but you know, he had the heat. He was really popular.
So him versus Honky Tonk Man is a heel versus heel match then.
I wouldn't. Yeah, I mean, like I said, it wasn't quite like he was a heel. He just was like he was just Macho Man. You know what I mean?
Okay. Almost like an anti-hero ish at that point.
Yeah, he's a little like Wolverine, I guess.
Yeah, there wasn't anybody quite like Macho, really.
Yeah, because everybody
or sense either.
Yeah, like everybody. So you know, especially in the WWF. I mean, you saw it in the WCW and the ones that we watched. It's like, you know, that you have like all your good guys and like all your bad guys, right? So like if one good guy's getting beat up, like all the other good guys run out and, you know, help out, and all the bad guys, you know. So it was very much factions. Macho Man kind of at the time he kind of was just kind of like floating in the middle of that. He didn't really get into one or other. I mean, at that time, he was going up against mostly heels, but he still wasn't like, hey, I'm buddies with Jake the Snake. Like, he wasn't that kind of thing either.
And Jake is possibly another somewhat of a middle ground gray character. Possibly. He's more of a lone wolf.
Yeah, he definitely was. He definitely was.
A solo Lobo, if you will.
God, he was so good.
So that was what was leading up to that. Like over the course of months, you know, it had been after WrestleMania 3, you know, it had been like 6 months since that, and that was pretty epic. You know, Hulk beat Andre. Hulk was still in the midst of fighting all like Andre and like Bobby Heenan's the Bobby Heenan family crew, and then it was like Macho Man was trying to get back to that Intercontinental title. And he definitely had, like, again, he definitely had the heat. Like, his popularity was rising, like, higher than ever. And so, yeah, it was Saturday night's main event. I think there had been, at one of them before he had gotten jumped or something, or on Superstars. I don't remember what led up to that particular thing. But, yeah, so it was Macho Man versus Honky Tonk, and... yeah, the rest was history.
So for those of us out there who haven't seen the match, can you give like a sort of an overview as to what happens and what's sort of the main takeaway from it and everything like that?
Yeah.
And then we can do like a general discussion about all kinds of notes that I have. You know, notes that, like, for example, I will always love Mean Gene. That's one of my notes, and I'm so happy I saw him. But yeah, for those out there who have not seen it, and I'll list in the show notes, I'll list what episode, like how to find it on Peacock, but I won't be able to probably post a link to it. So.
Yeah, so, I mean, it kind of, you know, so Honky Tonk Man's manager was Jimmy Hart, Mouth of the South, Jimmy Hart, who's also another really great, if you ever can catch him on a podcast or anything, is really great talker, and really he's like a really nice guy as well. Macho and Honky Tonk Man were fighting, you know, doing the regular thing, and Jimmy Hart kept like kind of like jumping in the way, and then I think like Jimmy gets knocked out by Macho.
Yeah, he goes down. He goes down. Yeah, he's dead.
Yeah,
it's
and
gone.
So, yeah, and then you know, and all of a sudden the Hart Foundation comes out, and like, you know, so they kind of take care of Jimmy Hart, and then they come back out, and so they're outside. Kind of watching over. One thing happens after the next. Macho Man's about to win, and then the Hart Foundation jumps in and starts beating up a Macho. Disqualification. The belt can't change hands on a disqualification or count out. So they start just beating him up, whatever. Hart Foundation is holding Macho Man. This was like a classic moment, and Honky Tonk Man gets out his guitar. He like measures them up. He's gonna hit him on the other side, and he's like, no. He's gonna hit him on the head. Makes this really mean face, and you know, Vince McMahon is like commenting on it, and then he just whacks him on the top of the head. And that, you know, 1987 TV, that was actually like Like, I mean, that was, I mean, I still, when I was watching it the other day, I was like, man, that's a legit hit. Like, kind of saw Macho Man kind of tense up and close his eyes when that was coming. So he was bracing for this guitar to hit him on the head. And then, meanwhile, and then like Honky Tonk Man had like tossed down Miss Elizabeth, like pushed her pretty hard.
Yeah.
And then she didn't know what to do. So she's like, she goes away to the back, whatever, and they're still beating up on Macho Man. And all of a sudden, she comes out and she's leading Hulk Hogan. And like, my mind just blew up because there had been no connection between the two at all. And there was no I never thought that would happen. Like, you're used to that happening. Like, somebody gets beat up and then like somebody comes running out, and usually there's like a connection between the two, or if there's no connection, like, okay, there's going to be some kind of alliance. But in that case, I just never in a million years would have thought it would be Hulk Hogan. So, and the thing that's like kind of important about it was what we were just talking about before, about the anti-hero, and he was still a heel. Hulk Hogan came out and fought off the Hart Foundation and the Honky Tonk Man or whatever. But then they were all riled up and running around the middle of the ring, Macho Man and Hulk Hogan. They were back to back, and they kind of backed into each other. And then they turned around and they kind of squared off. So that's to kind of shows you that like they stood, like there wasn't this like alliance between them. And then they had the great moment where like Vince McMahon, just like his voice, and he was, again, listening to this, like there's so much I could talk about, but it just like the pageantry and the stage and everything about it. The presentation was great. But it was the meeting of the Madness and the Mania, and then their arms kind of like slowly go together, and then they shake hands. Vince McMahon's like, yes, yes. And it's just the music, like Macho Man's music starts going off, and they're cheering. I was just like, what just happened? This is great. Yeah. And then, and that kicked off like I don't even think that alliance lasted like quite a year, I don't think. I know they were like, they and a couple other people grouped up for Survivor Series. It was like, the SummerSlam. It was the first SummerSlam where it was Hulk Hogan and Macho Man versus, who was it? Was it Andre and $1 Million Man, maybe?
It was, because this led into, this gave Macho the rub for WrestleMania 4, which was the tournament, right? And where Macho won. And then it was Macho and Hogan, but Macho was the champ, and of course he gets all paranoid and shit.
Which like had some shades of like real life, apparently.
Well, yeah, Macho was a real paranoid dude.
It was like, and that's the other fascinating part about wrestling, is how much like the intertwining between reality and their fiction, and
right.
But yeah, so that kind of set the stage, and Macho, like he actually went like pretty hard villain for a while after he was at odds with Hulk Hogan again, and he had a new manager, Sensational Sherry, and he was the Macho King, and
I don't think he turned face again until he had his retirement match with Warrior at WrestleMania 7, maybe, and then he became a commentator, but he was like a face commentator until he went to WCW.
Yeah.
Right?
So that was the match, and like I said, that Saturday night at the time, again, like I think I picked WWF, like there's a big aspect to it where it was like kind of like a cartoon or something, but it was the most, like, it had the most pop culture cred of everything, and so especially at the time. We didn't have like a ton of outlets to watch stuff. So it was actually on broadcast TV. It wasn't like on cable, which was, again, cable was a barrier for me because we didn't have cable. So that was like WWF was the only thing I could like really watch religiously until like later when I would visit my grandparents and they had cable. So then I could watch all the A Great American Bash and all that stuff in the summer for the NWA and WCW stuff. But yeah, so it was like once a month on Saturday they'd have Saturday night's main event, and it was like the big card. So it was like you got to see the good matches without actually going to the events. And all when you watch Superstars of Wrestling and Wrestling Challenge, just like you said, it was always like them fighting the jobbers, like the scrubs, basically. And they might have like one good match you wanted to see, but Saturday night's main event was like all like things that would be on the card that you'd want to see. So
Yeah.
it was a great moment, and it was like set up so much stuff down the road. And eventually, the other thing I was thinking about talking about, I didn't have much to talk about it, was when Honky Tonk Man, like it was SummerSlam when he lost the belt to finally lost the belt to Ultimate Warrior.
Finally.
That was another great mind blowing moment. But it was so much stuff I could talk about, but that's it.
Zach, what about you, buddy? Did you see this in real time?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I remember when it happened. It all got brought back. My one little criticism about the Peacock and WWE, and I understand it's an age-old criticism, but because they don't have the licensing to the original music, they pipe in sometimes generic songs, which is really lame. However, that doesn't taint the product. Diallo's right. The commentary, it's really interesting. WWF, their style of commentary was so dramatically different than NWA's or other territories. Other territories tended to have more of a like play-by-play legit kind of thing, where they were more technical, like Gordon Soley, who's a legendary interviewer, announcer, Jim Ross, obviously, which we'll get to in a minute, but WWF was like larger than life. Everything was huge, and you could make or break somebody based on the commentators commentating on him, right? So if Vince McMahon is blowing up this guy in a good way, it's going to make him seem even bigger and better than he actually is. And so it was bringing all those memories back. I forgot how, I didn't forget, but I was reminded of how meek they made Elizabeth seem,
Oh my
and how
God.
timid and like she wouldn't, it's like she was almost like a deaf girl, where she wouldn't talk practically. And Macho has a promo with Mean Gene backstage before the match begins, and it is a gold promo. Like that's a promo that you could play without the video, and it's amazing, where he's talking about the Danger Zone, and I implore anyone to look up the Danger Zone promo from this Saturday night's main event, because it is gold. He personified what it is to be a wrestler. You talked about how hard it was to vocally do the things you did, but these guys, like, a lot of the stuff was rehearsed. It was scripted, but still, like, they're acting their asses off, and it's not just verbally, but they're physically doing the stuff.
Yeah.
So they're telling a story, and Macho was, Diallo could go on and on about this too, but Macho, he would plan his match out from bell to bell, basically. And he was like a technical master when it came to that stuff. So what he did in the ring was always perfection, in my opinion. But, and then Honky Tonk is like, yeah, he's the quintessential heel. He was that heel. He's like old school heel, where he's just a piece of crap. Like, the guy just is a terrible wrestler. He's really a terrible wrestler. But the guy who plays Honky Tonk Man, he's a legit nice guy. It's no offense to him. He does what he does well. But he's not a good wrestler, and it drove me nuts as a kid, because I'm like, I wanted to see a good wrestler with that belt around their waist, because the IC title meant something back then. It still means something now, but it went through phases. Intercontinental Championship was not as prestigious in the mid-'90s. But, man, it brought back all the feels, and it reminded me of how Hulk Hogan, regardless of who he is now, back in the 80s, he was the Michael Jordan of wrestling. He was the guy. He was the faceplate of the business. So you automatically associated, like you associated Mike Tyson with boxing, you associated Wayne Gretzky with hockey. Like he was that guy for wrestling fans, whether you like it or not.
I actually don't think wrestling would be what it is today without Hulk Hogan. It goes beyond just wrestling fans. It was just like he was like a pop culture phenomena. Like people that don't know wrestling, they still knew who he was. And if he wasn't who he was at that time, and it was like a kind of like a lightning in a bottle thing, because Vince McMahon was very integral in that. But it was just I don't know if he didn't exist. I don't think wrestling would be what it became.
No, I agree. I totally agree. And you can't, for anybody that's like, well, but who he is now. And again, I'll stress it is back then. I'm not talking about who he is now and what we found out later on. Who he is. Yeah, I totally agree. Wrestling would not be what it is if it wasn't for Hulk Hogan. And if anyone's wondering if Hulk Hogan can actually wrestle, go look up his wrestling matches that he did in Japan, which are legit badass matches, because the guy can go. He just wasn't, but Vince wanted to keep him in a certain, he never wanted him to get injured. And if you're not going to get injured if you have 3 moves, right? You know what I'm saying? So anyways, it brought back all the feels. I loved it. I could watch wrestling 24/7. I could eat it, drink it, poop it, all that good stuff. So how about you? So Corey, do you remember watching this on television as a kid?
No, I never saw this particular match as a kid, but I realized quickly that I had seen pieces of this, especially the promo, the final promo between Macho Man and Hulk after they've sort of done their team up and everything, and now they're talking about, I don't know if the world's ready for this, you know what I mean? And they're trying to shake each other's hands, and it's become sort of a meme and everything, but I'm like, I'm tickled because I'm like, oh, I get to see where this came from. But, that aside, watching it pretty much for the first time in 2023, it was such a fun match to watch. I even popped when Miss Elizabeth came out with Hulk. I didn't know it was coming. I mean, again, this is all new to me. So, I'm sitting on the edge of the bed because we only have Peacock in the bedroom PlayStation, and I haven't logged in on the new one, so I was watching in the bedroom, and I stood up. I was like, oh, my God, it's Hulkamania, I mean, I fucking popped for it, man. Hulkamania.
Hey, everybody.
And I thought it was great. And, I mean, this is nostalgic wrestling for me. I know all these guys mostly from the cartoons and the toys and all that kind of stuff, but I know Honky Tonk Man, I know Sika, my God, that was so racist, but I recognize that guy, Mean Gene Okerlund, oh my God, we talk about Hulk Hogan being the face of wrestling. Weirdly, not gonna lie, Mean Gene to me is the face of wrestling. I'm comforted by him. He reminds me of my childhood. I always liked his voice and everything.
Macho got him to break character too when he's doing that promo, because he said, I forget the exact line.
Where he laughed or something at him. He's like, "That's not funny, brother," or something like that.
Yeah. What's so great about it? Because he's been one of the few guys to really shake Mean Gene.
Yeah, I can see it.
But Mean Gene he's the man. He's the backstage man.
As a first-time viewer in 2023, I thought this match was a lot of fun from 1987. And like I said, I didn't even see Hulk Hogan coming. So that was awesome for me.
And by the way, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Did you notice that didn't Macho have a Jimmy Hart figure in his hand too?
I saw that, and he went to bite it or something, but
yeah. The big ass LJN figures.
Yeah.
Oh my God. I love those figures, but I'll get to that when we talk about my.
I did have a question though. First off, who was the other Hart guy? Not Bret the Hitman Hart. Who was the other one?
That was Jim the Anvil Neidhart. He he was great. The Hart Foundation was my favorite WWF tag team for quite a while, and then that transferred into my love of Bret Hart, who to me is my all-time favorite wrestler. So
my next question then was, is Jimmy Hart related to Bret the Hitman Hart, or was it just a gimmick?
No, it was actually kind of funny because as I was watching that, I was like, oh, it just kind of was a happy little accident. I think they just.
Oh, so like Bret the Hitman Hart's name was already that, and Jimmy Hart's name was already that, and they were like, oh wait, why don't we combine these guys?
Well, I don't know about Jimmy Hart, but Zach, you probably know more, but like Bret Hart, his family is like a wrestling family, and
Yeah, the Hart Foundation.
yeah.
Neidhart is
Yeah, and then like a British Bulldog, Davy Boy, he married Bret's sister or something like that, so he was a part
Yes.
of that family too. And Jim the Anvil, just he had Neidhart was in his name, and that's why they got paired up, I guess. When
he's like
Vince's magic carnival brain, he was like, you guys are together, and then you all had the name Hart, and they become the Hart Foundation. So
Hey, you mentioned Davy Boy because he's in my segment that I'm going to be talking about last, and he's the British Bulldog.
Yeah.
But I was watching it and I was reading about it, and they called him Davy Boy, and I was like, but I thought that's the British Bulldog. So I was actually right. I thought that Wikipedia was steering me wrong, but I was actually correct.
Yeah.
Well, he was in the tag team, the British Bulldogs, but the other guy, Dynamite Kid, I think he suffered a lot of brain damage, and
he was in bad shape for a while.
Yeah, if you look up what he's kind of fallen on hard times and lost his mind a little bit.
Oh.
So but Dynamite Kid was very much like Chris Benoit in his abilities.
Okay.
Actually, Chris Benoit cited him as one of his influences back in the day because Dynamite Kid wrestled the exact same way Chris Benoit wrestled with that flying headbutt.
Yeah.
You do enough headbutts, it's gonna cause some brain damage.
Yeah, I mean, he was known for that. Hey, off the top rope, he would like do that drop or something, right? Yeah.
Yep, that's exactly what Chris Benoit took from him too. So.
Well, just looking over my notes, I don't really have anything else left other than poor Miss Elizabeth was definitely treated very poorly by Vince McMahon in the commentary, like constantly. Just constantly, Vince McMahon was kind of a piece of shit.
By Vince? I missed that. Like, do you mean by Bob? Like, was it Jesse? Was it Jesse or Bobby that was doing the announcing of that?
It was Bobby.
I thought it was
set it up.
I thought it was Vince McMahon called her useless, but it may have been.
No, that was probably
Bobby the Brain.
That was that was actually a feature, and that, another. Watching this was so fascinating because I hadn't watched this in this particular. I haven't watched Saturday Night's Main Event in forever. But like knowing what I know more about like production and that kind of stuff, I was like he definitely put together a package and a product. And I would just happen to be looking at this thing just a few days ago. It was there's like a political commentator show I listened to. They had Jesse Ventura on. And Jesse was talking about what led him to be an announcer. And he was, according to him, he was one of the first like announcers of his ilk, so to speak, where like he played the heel announcing, because that hadn't really been done before. And then again, like Vince McMahon just brought all these things into wrestling that hadn't really been done before he broke away from a lot of the past. But then Bobby Heenan, I always loved it when Bobby Heenan was doing announcing, because he just he kind of doubled down on that, and he was like so vicious. But like Vince McMahon, he was so like just like everything all the good guys did were just so perfect and so good, and then like and Jesse and Bobby, it's like whatever the bad guys did, they would make excuses, and it was great to hear. And it also informed to me when I listen to politicians now. Like, I definitely and I made a joke about it, but I was serious. Like, when I hear politicians cover for stuff that something happened and it was wrong, and you watched them cover for it, I think back to when I used to watch wrestling, and I watch Jesse, the guy, hit another guy over the head with a pipe, and Jesse's like, oh, that was legal in Japan, that's okay, that kind of stuff. And it's, and Jesse actually talked on that show. They had brought up Donald Trump, and they said Donald Trump had actually learned a lot of what he did later from Vince McMahon, because he had appeared in wrestling and that kind of stuff. So anyway, not a commentary on like politics, but it just that whole showmanship thing was really fascinating. So I think it was Bobby that you were. I think that you were hearing being just terrible.
He was pretty brutal. He was pretty fucking brutal, man. Yeah. Called her useless at one point. But my last note, though, I know he didn't win, but man, Macho Man's flying elbow sort of at the end of the match was just a fucking thing of beauty to watch. Yeah. It was just amazing. His pose, he looked like a goddamn superhero.
Yeah, man, he was
fucking amazing.
He was great. Like him and Ricky Steamboat, they used to just go at it. Like, and I think that's Zach. It was some years ago. We watched the documentary on I don't know if it was Ricky or Macho Man or whatever, but they talked about they talked about how they would coordinate the matches and how technical Macho Man actually was, and like he brought that to the public. I think he brought that like high flying sort of style to wrestling. He did that. He used to do that hammer drop off the top ropes too, and some other stuff that he would do like on the side of the ring, and it was so great to watch. It's so great.
Well, and him and Steamboat are two of the most technically savvy wrestlers, and Steamboat could go with anybody in the ring and make him look amazing. So if you got two guys that can do that for other people, and they're facing each other, then it's gonna be a gold match.
Some of those matches between Steamboat and Ric Flair were just like, phew. Oh my
God.
God.
I mean, that's another guy too. He could make anybody look good, but we'll talk about that in a second.
Well, we got some Ric Flair coming up. We got a very bloody and a very terrible haircutted 1991 Ric Flair.
Story for that too.
Wyndham.
My God, he has like a haircut of a 5-year-old blonde boy. It's wild. But
are we going to get into this?
Yeah, we're going to get into this. We're going to be talking about War Games at the WCW WrestleWar 1991. Zach, tell us about this one, baby. Hey, everybody. Corey here. I just want to let you know that we'll be right back after these short messages.
Imagine being one of the last people on Earth, being trapped alone with something not human, something always watching, something always waiting. What would you do? Where would you run? Where would you hide if you were haunted for 7 winters alone?
Podcasting After Dark presents 7 Winters Alone, a dystopian haunted house story by David Irons.
Available now in paperback and ebook.
And now, back to the show.
So this aired in February of 91. There's a lot of little backstories here. So the War Games match itself has been around since the mid to 80s. I believe the first one might have been the Horsemen versus the Road Warriors and Dusty Rhodes, and maybe Nikita Koloff. I got to go back and fact check that. We're not talking about that match. I'm just saying that the War Games started a long time ago. Basic concept of the War Games match is it's 2 wrestling rings right next to each other with a cage that surrounds them with a top on the cage. So it's 2 teams, 4-on-4, and 2 wrestlers started out, and then a coin is tossed after about a 5-minute period, and whoever wins the coin toss can send their next representative in and becomes a 2-on-1, and they get an odds advantage until all 4 wrestlers from both sides are in the ring, and then it becomes essentially a submit or give up match at the end to determine who the winner is. WrestleWar 91 was, at this point in the game, WCW, which was originally NWA, had rebranded, trying to do new things. I believe Jim Herd was the head of the company at the time, and he was, over the course of the past couple of years, was doing stupid gimmicks like the ding dongs, which are these wrestlers that would come in the ring with bells on their bodies and they get the shit kicked out of them. Bells would be flying everywhere. And he was taking guys that were established and shaking them up. And one person he shook up was Ric Flair. He had Ric Flair cut all his hair off and at one point wanted to give him an earring. And Rick was like, what are you doing? You know, this is according to Ric Flair's interviews that he's done on his documentaries, saying that he was totally adamantly against cutting his hair, but he did it because he was told to do it like a good soldier. But this match was Sting, who was the top babyface of the company at the time, with the Steiner brothers, which were probably the top tag team at the time, and Brian Pillman, Flying Brian Pillman, who later became Loose Cannon Brian Pillman in the mid-90s when he turned heel in WWF and had a very cool run as with Stone Cold Steve Austin back in the day. But when he first came into the company as a rookie, you know, he was a former Cincinnati Bengal, and that was his gimmick, that he was like this little guy, but he had a never give up attitude.
Well, his shorts were patterned after the Bengals as well.
Yeah, that was totally on purpose. So there was the four of them versus, which was originally supposed to be the Four Horsemen at the time: Ric Flair, Barry Windham, Arn Anderson, and the new addition to the Horsemen, Sid Vicious. They have gone through many Horseman incarnations throughout the years. This was one that didn't last very long, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But Arn Anderson had injured himself, so they had Larry Zbyszko fill in for Arn Anderson. Why? Well, it's kind of random why he did. It was like he just fit the bill. And Zbyszko is an AWA World Heavyweight Champion. He was like he was the face of AWA for a while.
I've never even heard of him.
He's a legit good wrestler. He just, you know, wasn't as over as some of the other guys.
One of the matches I used to watch in AWA, I remember back before I really was in wrestling, I think it was Larry Zbyszko. He or was it Kurt Hennig? He punched Kurt Hennig with a roll of quarters or something to win the championship. Yeah,
I think so. Yeah, because Kurt, I think, ultimately won it from Nick Bockwinkel, or the other way around. But yeah, he had matches with Kurt Hennig before Kurt Hennig became Mr. Perfect. Bloody matches too. But this match, this is an interesting story. So, you have to go back to 1989 when Ric Flair, the Horsemen were disbanded at this point. Ric Flair was having a feud with Terry Funk, and Sting came in to assist, and the Horsemen started getting put back together. And Sting was a new member of the Horsemen, but then he became the number one contender of the world title, which was being held by Ric Flair at the time. And the Horsemen said, you can't do that. You can't challenge one of your own. So they kicked him out of the Horsemen on a Clash of Champions event. Clash of Champions were basically free pay-per-views that the NWA would put out instead of the monthly pay-per-views that the WWF was doing in between their other pay-per-views. And they were good. The early Clash of Champions are great. I highly recommend you go back and watch those if you're a fan of this brand. So they kicked Sting out in this clash. Sting comes back later that night to basically take revenge on the Horsemen, who are now heels at this point because they beat down Sting. But Sting injured his leg in the process, and he was tapped to become the next world champion. He was going to wrestle Ric Flair and win at Starrcade, but he couldn't, which was like the later pay-per-view that year. This is like mid-89, fall of 89. Gets injured. He's out for like 6 months, right? So now we're into 1990. Sting finally comes back, wrestles Ric Flair in the summer of 1990, wins the championship at the Great American Bash. It's a big deal. Carries the title for a while. Flash forward to January of 1991. Ric Flair beats Sting at a house show, which is a not televised event for the world title and wins the world title. So now he's the world champion.
Why wasn't that
But it's
televised?
Because there was a dispute, there was a rebranding going on. They changed over from NWA to WCW. So he was now the WCW champion, and there was so much backstage politics going on of who should win the belt, who should not win the belt, when they should win the belt. So they just had Sting drop it at a house show, which is bullshit, right? In this time, the American Dream, Dusty Rhodes, who was in the WWF with his polka dot gimmick, comes back to WCW and becomes the head booker of WCW, which is basically the matchmaker, right? The producer of the matches. And starts kind of trying to do, like, relive some of these solid storylines that were working earlier in the previous year with Sting and the whole contingency. So Sting's battling the Horsemen, but Sting needs a crew. So he brings in the Steiner brothers, and they need another guy. They bring in Pillman, right? A month before WrestleWar, and I'm sorry if I'm going on too long. A month before WrestleWar,
Yeah, I know. I'm riveted.
A month before WrestleWar, there's another Clash of Champions. Scott Steiner, who's in the Steiner brothers with the long mullet and no beard, was tapped to potentially be the new face of the company, a new baby face, as a single wrestler. And he wrestles Ric Flair to a 25-minute draw for the world title at a Clash. And it's a really great match. And it proves yet again that Ric Flair could get in the ring with anybody and make them look good. But Scott Steiner was not a very good talker on the mic, and he was better in a tag team, in my opinion.
Sorry, can I divert real quick?
Yeah.
I've always liked the Steiner brothers because I was always a big fan of the Frankensteiner. But later in the late 90s, which Steiner went on to become the completely jacked monster with the metal helmet? Huh?
That was Scott Steiner.
Okay, so
Scott Steiner.
That was Scott. Okay, got it. All right.
He later became Big Papa Pump.
That's Big Papa Pump. Yep. And he had like a chain mail like sort of hood thing on and stuff like that. Yeah. Okay. Sorry.
And his promos during that time were really good. But as a face, he needed help. You know, it's like the Hardy Boys, the tag team from the 90s and early thousands. They were better as a tag team because both of them were not good talkers. Anyways, until Matt Hardy reinvented himself. But this storyline was starting to culminate with this War Games match. This was supposed to be it. This was supposed to end the feud, right? The night before, at a TV taping, Brian Pillman gets attacked by the Horsemen and injures his shoulder, which goes into the storyline of the War Games. But Brian Pillman's such a fighter. He's such a scrappy young dog that he wants to get in the War Games first. But the whole build up to this was like Sting's like, I'm going in first to take on the Horsemen, and you'll go in last. But when this match starts, Pillman goes in first, pisses off Sting, and the Steiners are like, what are you doing? And he gets in this match to face off with Barry Windham, who is the one of the Horsemen.
So what you're saying, with everything so scripted and controlled, Flying Brian going in first was not a part of the plan?
It was a part of the plan because it was. That was not off script.
Okay.
But, you know, in storyline,
they're like, whoa, okay, but it's not off script, though. Got it, okay.
No, and this is a perfect example of why Dusty Rhodes is a great storyteller, because he's the booker for this. He's the matchmaker for this. He's the kind of producer of this match. He knows how to tell a story. Dusty Rhodes, you know, for un-PC term, was a fat ass who, like, didn't look good in the ring, but man, that guy could wrestle his ass off and he could talk his ass off. So it didn't matter what he looked like. And people were like, this guy's amazing, right? And then when he decides to kind of retire and goes behind the scenes, his mind is still there, like, for wrestling. He knows how to create drama in a match. And dare I say, this is one of the most dramatic War Games matches of all time, because what it builds up is this tension. Is this young guy, Brian Pillman, goes in this match and he's like kicking ass, but then he starts getting his ass handed to him, and you're like, oh my God, they're going to kill this kid, right? And this match is super bloody. I picked this match specifically for tonight because it is one of my favorite matches of all time, because it's not just the wrestlers in the ring, but it's the commentators. Jim Ross, who later became good old JR in the WWF or E, was at his top game as a commentator. Like, this is the opposite of WWF. This was like the technical commentator, right? And he could really create a story with his words. And Dusty Rhodes was the other commentator. And, he's fueling, they're both faces, and they're fueling the match with their words. And you're seeing these guys just beat the hell out of each other.
It's bloody. It's a bloody match.
Yeah, and it's legit bloody. They're rubbing their faces against the chain link fence. And if you've ever had that done to you, you know that it's going to create some blood.
Flying Brian's biting on people's heads and getting blood in his mouth. I'm like, holy shit.
Biting people's heads. And then the only drawback to this whole thing was the fourth member of the Horsemen, the newest member, Sid Vicious, who's a big motherfucker.
Yep.
Guy's like 6'5", 6'6".
Fucking Sabretooth looking motherfucker right there.
Yeah, and he looks great. And you know what? He later went on to become Sid Justice and then became Sid Vicious again in the WWF.
And later went on to break his leg and poop himself in a match.
Pretty much, yeah. When he came back to WCW, he was super green, and he was super new, and he was calling out moves like super out loud on camera. He just did not know the business like all these other guys did. Arn Anderson, who was legit injured at the time outside, you could tell he was pissed because fucking Sid looks like a buffoon. Like, I'm going to slam you now. And you're like, oh my God, dude, you're on camera telling you, right? So, and then he legit injures Pillman by power bombing him head first on the ground, drops him on his head, which was not scripted. He wasn't supposed to do it like that. And they called the match early because of that.
Wow. Okay, so
the match ends,
that was real then at the end.
Yeah, that aspect of it, that part of the match was legit. Like that, Pillman did injure himself. They were gonna, allegedly they were going to have it kind of end with the Horsemen winning anyways, but maybe more dramatic. But they called it early on because they did not want Pillman to get. They thought he broke his neck.
I mean, fucking Sid Vicious power slammed him twice, and you can tell he's like already dead. And I sent you guys that Simpsons gif, like, stop, he's already dead.
Well, at one
you
point,
can see his lifeless body just all gone.
At one point, Vicious throws him on the ground or throws him against the turnbuckle, and he says, "Oh, are you okay?" Like out loud on camera, because he's such an idiot. Apparently, he got into a knife fight with Arn Anderson soon after this, and knifed Arn Anderson a bunch of times. And, there's a whole backstory to that too, which I think it's on the Four Horsemen documentary that the WWE put out.
Wasn't his name Psycho Sid at one point? So that was.
Yeah. And so the match did not end the way it was supposed to, but I think legitimately it was a beautiful match from beginning to end. It showcases in this cage, and you guys, everyone listening, you have to picture this. The cage is, the roof of the cage is maybe at 8 feet. So there's not much room from the top turnbuckle to the top of the roof of the cage. So these guys are using the cage. They're climbing in. They're throwing each other off.
Dude,
Scott Steiner's using his moves and legit Sting's bench pressing people.
Sting's bench pressing Ric Flair against the top of the cage. Ric Flair's like, it's fucking wild.
It's wild. So I that's why I chose this match. I want to open it up to you guys because I don't want to talk too much about it. But I ate and slept NWA, WCW at this time. It was my favorite organization. It was my favorite characters. I love the legit good versus evil. The Four Horsemen kicking Sting out of the Horsemen storyline is so good. It's so good, so powerful. Because they did such a great job at that time of you really believing these guys were friends, and then out of nowhere turning on each other. The heel turns they did in this organization felt authentic. So did they did in the WWF too, but it was just, for me, this was everything. And Flair's haircut sucks. That takes away from it. Zbyszko being the match kind of sucks too. He's fine for what he does. But, getting to see the Steiners like wreck shop in this match.
Well, Scott Steiner had a double clothesline that was fucking awesome in it.
Yeah, those guys just could go. Barry Windham had long hair. He cut his hair short too. So this match started the downfall of Ric Flair's relationship with the company. Ric Flair would eventually leave the company in a couple months, go to the WWF with the world title, and that created a whole controversy. And Barry Windham ended up becoming wrestling Lex Luger for the world title at Great American Bash later that year, like a new world title.
Was Barry Windham the first guy that was also in with Flying Brian? Is that
he was the first one? He got
Barry
the first
Windham,
one to bleed, I think, in that.
Yes, he was. Yep.
Yeah,
He got super bloody, and he was bloody for the rest of the match. And then Ric Flair got really fucking. I mean, his blonde hair was like red. It was wild.
These crimson masks, yeah. And if you want to look up old school Barry Windham was an original horseman back in the day as well, with Arn Anderson, Ole Anderson, and Ric Flair. Actually, no, Tully Blanchard. So yeah, Ole Anderson left, and then Barry Windham. He was like in the second faction of the Horsemen. Before Lex Luger came in. And anyways, that's all a bunch of great history to go down on another podcast. But yeah, this War Games match, to me, like the way Jim Ross calls it, it's so dramatic. And you really feel like there's legit danger going on, because there kind of is. And I love it, but I'm opening up to you guys.
No, I love Jim Ross in that one. Diallo, because it's going to be the same flow as last time. I'll just finish by talking about what it's like to watch it for the first time in 2023. But did you watch this episode in real time, Diallo, or have you seen it before?
So I had never seen it before. Like I said, it was pretty difficult for me. Like I was either like running around. I was in college at the time, and I would come back in the summers, and then I would be able to watch like the programming that they had. It was like, for me, like the peak of the summer, and it still was like NWA, I think at the time, was the Great American Bash, and it was basically like 2 months of just intense wrestling from like, was it like July to August? It was great.
Yeah, they took it on the road.
Like that was like peak for me. I didn't really see a lot of like I never was able to see the Starrcade and all the other pay-per-view events, so I missed a lot of that stuff. But I used to watch it pretty Midnight Express is my other favorite tag team. Yeah. Anyway, so I kind of missed. I think I missed this era. Really, the one that we watched. And it was fascinating for me. I thought it was pretty terrible. And I don't say that to like, because like, again, I love all the wrestlers, and I'm watching people come in. I'm like, oh, there's Barry Windham, all that stuff. But I think that they were going through, and you talked about it a little bit earlier, Zach, where like they were going through this transition, I think at the time, and trying to like figure out what their brand was. And I saw it, like I had those thoughts before you said it, whereas I was watching the screen and I could tell they didn't know who they were at that moment in time. So
could you also tell that Ric Flair was uncomfortable with his haircut as well?
I mean, it's actually funny because I didn't know he had cut it at that point. I just remember him showing up in WWF with the bob haircut. So I didn't realize he had cut it before in WCW. But it was, and it's not to say, and again, it's not for me to say, I'm not trying to say WWF was a superior product. Because like I said, it's like, I messaged you guys a little earlier. It's because the WWF literally was a clown show at that time when they had Dink and Doink and all that stuff. And they had the larger than life superheroes, and they were kind of they were starting to go on this area. It would take some years that they started really going off the rails with some of this stuff. But when I was watching the Saturday Night's Main Event, it was interesting because it was like that was 87 and this was 91. And again, I was really noticing just how in that moment when they were doing the meeting of the Madness and the Mania, I started to pay attention to the cameras and the camera angles and how they were cutting, and they were doing really like close-ups, and they were getting all this stuff to capture the story and the drama, right? But when I was watching I watched that entire pay-per-view, I could tell that it wasn't ready for TV yet. It was that match. So like WWF did their steel cage matches, and like the steel cage was always like the fence, right? But then the WWF was like, well, we're gonna have this, you know, the cage that they had with the big red bars, and you could you could see into the ring, and that was geared for television rather than people showing up in person. My thought was. And so when I was watching the WCW event, I was like, yeah, this is really like, they don't get that people are like, millions can potentially be watching, and they were still building the event for just the people in the arena. So when you bring up Sid Vicious, right? And he was giving all of the, like, you could hear him like giving all the commands. Well, part of that was because they had the steel cage, which was the fence. And so they had to put the cameramen inside the ring because they couldn't do it from outside. And so the cameras were right on top of the wrestlers. And that's why obviously he was over the top of what he was doing, but it was even worse because the cameras were right on top of him. And they just weren't able to capture. There was a match that was earlier with I'm sorry I'm ranting about how bad. I'm sorry, Zach, but I
can see.
Hey, I don't think it's. I totally disagree with you that it's not a terrible match, but it wasn't. It's all good.
It wasn't the match. It was the presentation of the. And what I'm saying is, like, there was a product that the WWF. He understood that it was like a product, and I think the WCW at that time was still figuring that out, and they figured it out, because they figured it out and they blew up, and it was like larger than life. But there was a match earlier with when Ron Simmons and Hacksaw,
Doom.
So yeah, they were
Versus
fighting
the
the Freebirds, who we know and love them as the opening part of Highlander, the first movie.
Yes, of course.
But who was it? Like Butch Reed accidentally punched Ron Simmons, or vice versa. I don't remember. And the Freebirds won, and they were like going off screen, and the camera was following the Freebirds. But then, like, I could tell Dusty was like. He kept saying, like, oh, there's something going on in the ring. I don't know what's happening. Like, because he was trying to get them to put the camera into the ring, because that's where the real drama was happening. But the camera was following the Freebirds walking down the aisle back. So you didn't see, like, I didn't see what actually happened. I saw the aftermath where I could tell one of them had punched the other one. But it was like the WWF at that, like, they would have been all over that. They would have, like, because the staging of it would have been a lot better. So I watched the whole thing, and I was kind of like stunned a little bit. But again, that wasn't really in the era that I used to watch. I watched before when it was WWF, and it was like a lot smaller and a lot more intimate and a lot more brutal. And that same requirement wasn't like quite there, but and then I watched after. But this particular one, I felt like it was like kind of rough around the edges, and they were just trying to figure out how to rate up their game. So,
well, they were in disarray at the time, like behind the scenes. Behind the scenes, they were a mess, and because they had different ownership, and everybody was legit pissed and annoyed. And even at the end of the pay-per-view, they're like, we want to go back and show you what happened. Oh, we don't have that footage. Okay, so we're just going to end the pay-per-view now. And they did.
Well, that's what I was saying. Like, because I was a little, it wasn't, I was confused because I was like, was that planned with Pillman, or did he really get hurt? And then I was like, no, I think he actually really got hurt. But I was only really saying that because I know like that he passed years later, and I was like, is this where he got his injury? You know, I was kind of thinking that. But
oh no, yeah, Pillman got into a Hummer, a car accident.
Oh, did he? I thought he
thrown
was
from his car
okay. I didn't know that. That's how he died. But
well, no, he didn't die that way. He injured himself, and he wasn't the same after that. And that's when he went to ECW and became the loose cannon character, where he was legit like acting like he was going to whip his dick out in the ring and piss in the ring. Yeah. And it was really cool because he found a way to reinvent himself. But during this time, he was the high flyer, you know, the up and coming new kid that, you know, you could rally behind because he never gave up. And which is what I loved about him. And their whole storyline was feeding into like, well, what's going to happen next? Because he ended up having a match with Barry Windham at the next pay-per-view and like beating the shit out of him, you know, and which is great. Like he had his comeuppance basically.
Was the
Barry
so
Windham
remember when they were like it was like it was like the good guy Four Horsemen. So it was like Sting, Nikita Koloff, Dr. Death. Yeah, I remember
the
they
superpowers.
Was like, they did this thing where they were like they did the 4 up and then they would turn it down. Was that before or after this?
Yeah. That's way before. Like, yeah. So what I was saying earlier with the storyline, this storyline I feel like was a year late because of Sting's injury. Sting's injury really derailed a lot of things that the company kind of hedged all their bets on, right? And so because they did that, they didn't have the backup storylines that could have kind of been pushed forward like you had in the WWF at the time. You had, you know, other stronger storylines besides Hogan that could work, right? But then at the time in WCW, NWA moving into WCW, they were in such a transitional flux that they didn't know what they didn't know what they were doing, you know. So you have this War Games match though, which I think ultimately gets saved on one hand because you've got guys really giving their all in the ring, you know, and legit like kicking the shit out of each other. And you know, even as green as Sid was, he still looked powerful and menacing.
Oh, fuck yeah. He still looked like fucking Sabretooth, man.
And like I said, even Zbyszko had his moments too, you know, when he's getting his face pounded into the ground.
Yeah, or into the chain link fence and shit like that was, yeah.
So
the War Games, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just saying. So I'm not like bashing it per se. This is not the Great American Bash. It was an observation from like a production level kind of like.
Oh yeah.
I was just like I was watching it and I was kind of like, whoa, wait a minute, like why am like it just and like but it was like my sense of it was that they were trying to figure it out in real life, and that's what you're saying, and so it was like confirms my thoughts about watching it. And because I wasn't really into that like any of the drama at that time, I just was kind of I was watching the matches and stuff and just being like, oh man, this isn't as like sharp and put together as I'm like used to from those same people. That I think that's kind of where I was at. And then I kind of and like the end of the match, obviously he was injured, but it was just like I remember I said to myself, because I live by myself, if I had paid for this, I'd be pissed. That's what I said, just because of the way it ended. And it was like the referee like came on to explain why
he's like, I stand by my decision.
Yeah. And like it was and then I was confused because then I was like, wait, there was such showmanship about it. I was like, was that rehearsed or not? And it just kind of was like, and we're out, and like piece that there was no like I don't know. And so I was a little I was just like, yeah, it was just very rough around the edges. But like I said, they worked it out and they figured it out. And it like when I was watching some of the matches moving through it, like it was like a match with Brad Armstrong and what's his name, Bobby
Eaton.
Was it? Yeah, Bobby Eaton.
Yeah.
And then I was like, oh yeah, Brad Armstrong. Totally forgot about that guy. So I looked him up, and Jim Herd came up in that little discussion about him, and they were a lot of I started seeing more and more how people were like really down on Jim Herd's stewardship. And then when I saw the closing credits of the pay-per-view and I saw Jim Herd at the top, I was like, oh, okay. And it all made sense to me. So
Well, I mean, isn't all of this a testimony to the genius of Vince McMahon and how he can kind of, and I know we all agree, we know he's a horrible fucking person. He's sexist. He's fucking terrible. Yeah. But he's also a marketing fucking genius. He is. That's just what it is. And I mean, isn't it a testimony? Like, I mean, it's the best. And there's a reason why WWE owns pretty much everything, at this point. WCW too, because isn't it the obvious clear winner? Like, you know what I mean? Even back then it was the obvious clear winner, and then of course everything snowballs because then you have a bigger budget, and then of course with a bigger budget you can hire better camera crew and better camera operators. Like everything just gets snowballed outwards. But at the end of the day, isn't all of this a testimony to how much of a genius Vince McMahon is?
Well, I mean, Zach can talk to it like probably more than me. I've always outside of these last few years where the allegations have started to come out, I would always say, like when I started to realize where Vince McMahon came from, the pedigree he came from, the situation with what wrestling looked like at the time, and buying his company from his father, and he was like a visionary, and he did all these things to transform the sport, quote unquote sport, and he made it the most recognizable product. If I was a well-known screenwriter, I would write a story about that, because I find it fascinating, and it also because it's like the rise and fall, and it's not to celebrate him; it's actually to show how how dirty he could be in some spaces. But I think like with WCW though, it wasn't like the testament there was like, because right after this period that I'm talking about, like when I said they figured it out, they figured it out, and like they were still separate from WWE, because WWE didn't buy until like late 90s or like 2000 or something. I think.
Yeah. And in that era you're describing was actually way more short-lived, I think, than like it was like a 5-year period. Really, it wasn't that long. But this time period, like 91 to, I want to say 94, 95, when Hogan left and eventually came into WCW and things started to pick back up, was definitely a down time for them. When their big star Ric Flair leaves, suddenly they're like, whoa, shit, what are we going to do now? But if you go like those I want to say 83 to like 89 is a golden era for NWA as well.
So good.
But that's when you had all these other territories, basically wrestlers going from one territory to another, wrestling their people in their like little areas. Like World Class Championship Wrestling was based in Texas, so Ric Flair would go there and wrestle their guys there, right? So what you're describing, Corey, is in talking about Vince McMahon being such a genius, which he is in many ways, a visionary. He had a different kind of control over his company that these other companies didn't have. You had, circus. This is like it's circus, basically little mini circuses all over the country. And you had some guys who just wanted to make money and didn't give a fuck about the talent. Then you had some guys who let the talent run the whole thing, and that didn't go very well because the certain guys wanted to go over, and they caused infighting and whatnot. So what was going on, there was so many power struggles going on in all these other companies versus WWF, which had its own issues too, don't get me wrong, but they were able to control it better than these other companies were. And that's why all these other companies eventually folded and failed, because, and they'll blame WWF for, Vince McMahon came in and took my talent away. We're like, yeah, because he paid the guys more money. Like, that makes sense, and they had no insurance, so they need as much money as they can get, so there was all that backstage politics, which led to so much disruption on screen at times. I always say, like, that's one of the reasons I loved NWA, is because it was rough around the edges. And if you look at like World Class Championship Wrestling with the Von Erichs, those were great matches, but those guys could not cut promos, and those guys were not as good talkers as like a lot of the guys like Jake the Snake Roberts, for example. But there was magic in certain matches, and that's what stands out, I think, the most to me. And I think ultimately, I look back at the War Games match and I go, for all its flaws, like the magic around some of these characters was still there to an extent. Like the Steiner brothers were still legit badass. They eventually went to the WWF, Pillman would have gone to WWF earlier if he hadn't injured himself. He was in a tag team with Stone Cold Steve Austin soon after this, when Stone Cold was stunning Steve. When he had long hair.
Remember when he looked like Ric Flair with the bob? Remember that?
He did. Yeah, he was. They were called the Hollywood
Blondes.
When I
first.
And they.
Years later, I was like, wait a minute, that's the guy when he the Texas rattlesnake or whatever. Like years later, I'm like, wait a minute, I remember Steve Austin. That doesn't look like the guy I remember from like 10 years ago.
Right, and he got his start in Texas at World Class Championship Wrestling too. But he was pissed because he loved what he was doing with Pillman. They were great. They were a great heel tag team. But then Jim Herd was like, no, that's not going to work, and they basically wrote him off. But they were like a top heel team. Mm-hmm. So, these guys would go into the ring and work their asses off. Like Brad Armstrong, for example, like Diallo brought up, and Bobby Eaton were legit great wrestlers. But they just didn't get their moments to shine as much as they should have. Brad Armstrong became, he was like he's basically he was the best jobber to put in a match where you're like, this guy actually might have a chance, and then he would ultimately lose.
So Bobby the Brain Heenan, before he became a manager, he was a wrestler. Was Jimmy Hart ever a wrestler, or was he always a manager?
I think
he was always a manager. I think. Yeah, there was a few guys that were always like Jim Cornette. I think he was just they were like more promoters, I think, behind stage, and it was like that kind of deal. But
okay.
And I think Jimmy Hart got his start in Memphis wrestling with Jerry Lawler. I think that's where I could be wrong, but I think that's where he got his start. All these guys came from something else.
Yeah.
And ultimately a lot of times people are like, oh, WWF's homegrown talent. Well, Hulk Hogan started in the AWA.
Yeah.
And he was a bad guy when he first started.
What is it? Is that Atlanta Wrestling?
Oh, what? American Wrestling Association.
Okay. Yeah,
that was
he's from the
Minnesota
South, though,
one.
Isn't he originally, Hulk Hogan?
He's from Tampa.
Okay.
Yeah, they were all they were all all the wrestling organizations were regional, and I think when I've heard stories from other people. Where Vince did because it was back in the day when it was like a handshake kind of deal, and like he totally screwed people over. Like he stole he promised them stuff and kind of took over their like territories, and he just kind of spread out, and that's what I mean. It's like it's an ugly story. It's like, to me, it's like he's like a postmodern or modern like P.T. Barnum, like.
Yeah,
he definitely had like a genius knack for, like he would be like the dark side of the Greatest Show, that like you tell that story, but Vince McMahon is like the dark side of that.
But I mean, I don't think he's unique in the fact that, like, I think to become as big and successful as the P.T. Barnums and stuff, and as Vince McMahon did. I don't think you can be very ethical and be a very good person to get that level of success. I think there is a trade-off. Unfortunately for Vince McMahon, it's sort of a racist and sexist trade-off, and a lot of other things, very controlling, and a million documentaries out there talking about it. But he's definitely a genius. Like, in a certain regard, he is a genius, and you can't take that away from him, I don't think.
Yeah, I mean,
I think ultimately.
Okay.
I was gonna say you take Bruno Sammartino, who was the faceplate of WWF, and then he leaves, and all he does is go on a Vince McMahon hate campaign. Legitimately, he had legitimate things to say negatively about McMahon, and then helped a new company, UWF. You know, this is gonna be different than WWF. Everybody was gonna be different. It was always gonna be different. All these companies that would come up, but they would ultimately fail, unfortunately, because it's like going against Amazon, basically, you know? And
yeah, it's like, what are you going to do?
And then what does Bruno Sammartino do? He comes back and gets in, put in the Hall of Fame with the WWF. And there's him and Vince McMahon are basically making up. It's like Yellowstone in a way, you know, with Kevin Costner's character. It's like they always come back, you know. And Yellowstone's character, he's a nicer guy than Vince McMahon on paper, but it's this idea of like, you can't fuck with the main company. It's always going to win. And it did. It ultimately did win, and it beat out everybody, which is a shame because, you know, that Surfer Sting that we had, that didn't go on forever like I wished it would have. But I will say the action figures that they put out at the time, which were like mini versions of those giant LJN figures, were 10 times better than the LJN big dolls that they put out. And, you know,
I mean, as much as I love Crow Sting, I very much like, if you ever say Sting to me, Surfer Sting is always what pops in my head. Watching this episode, Zach's yours, the War Game one, I was like, I mean, he looks like a fucking superhero. I sent the boys a picture of that 2000 AD character, Martial Law, that UK character. Looks like fucking that, like just head to toe, like the colors and everything, and it's pretty amazing just watching all of these guys. You know, just they all look like superheroes. I keep saying it over and over again, but as a kid, I loved Sid Vicious. Obviously, I'm not that discerning because, you know, you guys have both proven that he's not really a technical, fighter. But I liked him as a kid because Sabretooth was and still is my favorite Marvel villain. And I thought he looked exactly fucking like him. I'm like, he's a walking persona of fucking Sabretooth.
That would be badass.
You know, and I'm just like waiting for him to say Birdie and like, snap his fingers, and it's just like, fuck, man, it looks amazing just to watch these guys wrestle. And yeah, watching Sid Vicious, I was a little bit underwhelmed, but I was equally overwhelmed with how cool Sting was. Like I said, when he was fucking pressing fucking Ric Flair against the top of the ceiling, and Ric Flair's like, it's great. And Ric Flair's selling it, even with his fucking terrible haircut that, his fucking self-esteem took a hit with that fucking haircut. He looks like a 5-year-old boy. But he's selling it, man. He's selling everything. And, it was fun. I had a fun time with it. I'm not going to lie, like Diallo, I could see the monetary differences between the two, but that didn't, take away from my enjoyment of the match. But you could see that it's not WWE. I mean, it's so blatantly apparent that it's not, and it's just WWF just had such a leg up on things. But this match was still pretty impressive and a lot of fun up until the end, and I just didn't understand what had sort of happened. I also didn't understand why I almost saw was it Flying Brian's? I almost saw his butthole when Sid Vicious fucking power bombs him. I was like, man, Flying Brian, you gotta shave all of that, didn't you? Because it's like his underwear like went right up there, which goes back to me as a kid always being like, I always liked the wrestlers who had the long pants and not so much the underwear.
I know. Look, because I marked out big time for Flying Brian. I thought he was the first guy I saw who would do this move. He'd hop up on the top rope and then jump off the top rope doing a flying clothesline off the middle of the top rope. And he was legit like super talented. And so he was a great babyface for me at the time. And then watching him get his ass kicked by Wyndham and Flair for 7 minutes or whatever it was, and building up that tension, and I'm like, oh shit, he's got this giant ass bandage on his shoulder to sell this injury that he had allegedly, and you're building up this great storyline. Like, what's going to happen next? And then Sting gets in there and wrecks shop. Butthole or no butthole, I still love that.
Well, you bring up a good point. I wonder if Flying Brian would have survived had he been able to actually utilize the top ropes, because the cage was so far down that they couldn't do anything of the sort, you know. So it almost makes you wonder if he would have had more of a chance to survive the match. I do just want to call out really quick that I saw that Hell in the Cell cage in real time where Mankind loses his tooth and all that kind of stuff. And I think that cage was higher so they could do like sort of more stuff in it. But it was fun to see sort of like a precursor, you know, cage match. Plus I'd never seen one where two rings were sort of pushed side by side. And I didn't watch the rest of the pay-per-view because I didn't really have time. Did they utilize the two rings next to each other, or did they just do that for that final match?
I'm sorry, Zach.
No,
that was another reason why. Like, I mean, I got it. Like, the logistics of actually, like, kind of stopping and putting another ring in there for that last event just wasn't realistic. But it's the kind of thing that, like, the WWF would have, like, they would, like, it felt awkward having, like, two rings side by side for the whole event. And it wasn't until they dropped the cage down that it became, like, a thing.
Apparent as to what this was for.
And I'm just saying that from, like, again, like, so when I think about, like sports, professional sports, and I think how, like, football's kind of, like, in the United States, just, like, it's basically like the number one sport, right? And I think like a lot of it is because it's a product that looks so much better on TV, so like everybody can access it. Like I went to a Niner game last year, and I almost was like, oh, I'd rather kind of watch it at home, because I know I'm going to get all the angles and I'm going to get the breakdowns and all that stuff. And I think that the WWF, Vince McMahon, he understood that, and I think that's a lot of why the strategy that he had, and that's why a lot of his league grew the way that it grew, because he was like, television is the future kind of deal. And but like watching the WCW, like again, I could talk about the way the steel cage is cool. I'm not saying that's not cool, but just for like watching it on television, it doesn't, like, it just doesn't, it's not as physically appealing because you can't quite see everything that's going on from a distance, different angles, so it's kind of stuck inside.
Did the cage thing start at WCW and then WWF made it better with the Hell in the Cell thing?
I don't know. I always saw cage matches, steel cage matches, just in wrestling, and it was like the kind of like the Vince kind. And then WWF, I think they were the ones that started to do like the bars, and that's like visually, it looked better because you could see in it, like, it just was more dynamic, right? It wasn't as gritty, you know, but anyways, it's just for television, it didn't work as well for me. So they had this two rings sitting there for the entire pay-per-view, and it just felt awkward and odd and kind of like, I don't want to use the word cheap, but it just felt like there's something like they just needed to figure out how to like package everything a little bit better. And I also feel like they just were trying to be more like WWF because that was the popular thing, but that wasn't their game. That's like they weren't WWF. They were NWA had turned into WCW, so they needed to figure out like who they were, which like they kind of sparked that with the NWO stuff after, you know, a few years later. So
well, and it should also be noted that between the two matches, you know, there's only X amount of years, like less than 5 years between the two matches, and that we watched, and the second match is infinitely bloodier. Mm-hmm. And my question is did WCW kind of find, was that their niche? Did they push the blood and the bleeding forward?
They were way darker.
Okay.
Yeah, WWF.
So WCW is a bit darker than
like
WWF?
Vince McMahon had like a no blood rule or something like that. So it was very much for families and, you know, like it was like a whole family entertainment thing. And NWA was where I went to like watch like the real fighters fight, you know? Yeah.
Okay. So the other guys, the other guys, the smaller guys, figured that violence was the way to sort of go up higher versus WWF, where Vince McMahon's like, let's keep it still sort of all ages to kind of capture every
At least with the
viewership.
blood. At least with the blood part, yeah.
Right. Which goes back to your point of like Vince McMahon having this very clear vision of TV, like broadcast TV is our future, and we can't just bleed all over broadcast TV. You know, maybe on cable you can, but not on broadcast TV, because that at the time that was still the bar, right?
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
I mean, Vince McMahon was like WWF had like those ice cream bars, like so they were selling action figures, and it's just that was their deal, you know. And I would pick up the wrestling magazines and read all the stuff that was going on in all the other leagues, and almost every picture was like a bloody head from somebody in some other league. But they never really covered. I don't really think they really covered WWF very much in those wrestling magazines. But like that's kind of what like the wrestling I saw. My uncle, like I remember him always like he knew all of, like Bruiser Brody and all these guys. He was like really into those guys, and it was like all blood and they were fighting. They were fighting everywhere, and I think. I mean, but it's interesting to me because like WCW, once they figured it out, they were sort of like, you know, I talked about like Macho Man sort of like was the archetype for his like kind of just being who he was, and I like instead of like having to be like good or bad, and then WCW kind of, I think, in my experience, really kind of took that on a little more, and then when they had they were kind of like the spark for what became the Attitude Era for WWF later. So I don't know, it's kind of like went back and forth, and they informed each other. But yeah, I didn't want to crap on your pay-per-view, Zach.
Oh, it's all to each his own. No, it's just different organizations.
I mean, I watched the whole
times
thing. Like I didn't have to, but I was like, I'm watching because like I wanted to watch it. Like I get to watch a pay-per-view. Yeah.
That's why I recommended that one match versus the whole thing, because I'm like, well, that wasn't my fit. If I had to pick a pay-per-view from there, I definitely would not have chose WrestleWar 91. But that match in particular has a nostalgic vibe for sure.
Zach, would you have picked WCW Clash of the Champions 24 in 1993 with the debut of Shockmaster?
But I'm wondering why. Yeah, so you did. Oh, boy. I mean, so this is a perfect example. Dusty Rhodes came up with that gimmick.
Okay.
And, yep.
Okay. Yep. All right. Well, I'm going to need you guys to sort of fill me in on some things. So, Shockmaster, I've known about this. I've seen the YouTube video, but I was like, what am I going to bring to the table? I'm going to just, try to figure out a little bit of the backstory. And this is just kind of to inform me. I don't expect our discussion will go as long as the last two for this one, but I got a little something prepared here, so. All right, so, guys and gals, the Shockmaster. Fred Ottman made an unforgettable debut as the Shockmaster at WCW Clash of the Champions 24 in 1993. But before we talk about that, let's have a little backstory on Fred. So, Fred Ottman was born August 10th, 1957, and got his start in 1985 when he wrestled for Championship Wrestling from Georgia. In September of 98, he went to Championship Wrestling from Florida as a heel called Big Steel Man, and he was managed by Diamond Dallas Page. Zach, you like to do his
DDP yoga.
And my buddy Xair is friends with Diamond Dallas Page in real life. So shout out to Xair. So Fred Ottman entered the World Wrestling Federation in 1988 as Tugboat. In 91, he became Typhoon and teamed up with Earthquake and became known as the Natural Disasters. After departing WWF for the WCW, the World Championship Wrestling, in 1993, Ottman then donned the glitter-covered Star Wars Stormtrooper helmet and became the Shockmaster. As I said, Shockmaster debuted at WCW Clash of Champions 24 with his team Sting, Dustin Rhodes, and Davey Boy Smith against Sid Vicious, Big Van Vader, and Cole. Unfortunately, after much hype from his teammates, Shockmaster bursts through the stage wall like the Kool-Aid Man, but he trips over a piece of wood and falls face first to the ground. As his helmet goes sliding across the floor, you can hear Sid Vicious holding back laughter. And Ric Flair, you can hear Ric Flair say, "Oh no." In the original airing, you can actually hear Davey Boy Smith say, "He fell flat on his arse, flat on his fucking arse." And they cut that later. Fred Ottman tried to recover, but the damage was done. He would forever be a wrestler. He would forever be a wrestling meme, a cautionary tale, and the living proof why stormtroopers can't hit shit. Now, it should be noted that they tried to push the Shockmaster gimmick further a little bit more, and they made him like a klutz. They're like, well, let's spin it. Let's make him into a klutz. But it never hit. It never sort of made it. But to this day, you know, they made an action figure of Shockmaster as a Comic-Con exclusive. Even in the packaging, he's upside down. But you know, from all reports indicate that Fred Ottman is a super nice dude. He loves talking about Shockmaster. He embraces it, and I think that's really fucking cool. And he's really positive about it. He's like, look, everybody in their life has a Shockmaster moment. You know, it's what you do after that is what defines you, and it's fucking true. We've all had a Shockmaster moment that was thankfully not aired, but his was.
Why do we fall? So we can get back.
Up, and he got back up. He did get back up.
He did. Yeah.
And finally, I just would like to note that the voice of the Shockmaster was done by Ole Anderson. He did other voices as well, but you can tell that when the Shockmaster stands up, he's gesturing like he's talking. But I think Ole Anderson was such in shock that he wasn't doing the voice.
Apparently, he was laughing also, or in the background.
I mean, So, and you know, moving forward, Fred Ottman has talked before about what happened. So multiple things went wrong. One, they told him that it was a full wall, like a normal wall, and he was going to have to really bust through it. And so he did, but it wasn't. It was you know, a fake wall. So he kind of toppled face forward because of his momentum. And also, too, it was a double entendre of things going wrong. There was the frame of the wall. There was a wooden plank on the bottom that was not there during rehearsal. So he trips over that because if you've seen the picture of Shockmaster, he can't see through the helmet at all. I don't know why anyone thought that was a great idea, but it is a Stormtrooper replica helmet spray painted with pink glitter all over, even the fucking eyepieces. It's opaque. He can't see through it at all. And he takes a dive. And it's hilarious, and I'm glad that, you know, he emotionally survived it. But it is considered to be one of the greatest gaffes in sports history.
Probably the best.
Yeah, and I'm happy that he's embraced it completely. But for me, I didn't see this in real time, but I've heard about it pretty much 93 and on. I've heard about it my entire life. It's you know, most people, especially wrestling fans, know about the Shockmaster debacle. And I just wanted this excuse to sort of maybe dive in a little bit deeper into it. But Zach, were you there for the debut of Shockmaster?
I mean, I watched it. I watched when it happened.
You saw that happen in real time?
Oh yeah.
What were your
Yeah,
thoughts, man?
I held on. I held on to the WCW for so long. I was like, come on, guys, you got to figure this shit out. You can do it. You can do it. Because, again, I loved the earlier era. And I was like, when are you going to go back to that? And they didn't. It just got more. They tried to copy WWF, like with more colorful characters. They brought the British Bulldog in at this point. He had the, from the WWF. That was their big get, right? And Flair came back and was doing a Horseman talk show with Arn Anderson, who was like injured at the time, again injured, because he actually was not paralyzed, but like has severe pain in one arm, and he couldn't move one arm for the longest time. Like so many just busted gimmicks that just didn't go anywhere. And then this comes out and I'm like, holy shit, it's going to be tugboats coming to the WCW, because I listened to the hotlines and I would pay the 99 cents to get the info on this shit. And I heard he was coming, and then he does. And you're like, oh man, no, this is so bad. It's so bad. It's so bad.
And so how much hype was before it, though? It was kind of hyped up, wasn't it? Like the debut
oh, yeah,
of Shockmaster?
Sting was talking about it. I've got a big friend that's coming in, I've got a big friend that's coming into the company. And Thunder and Hogan at this point, I think, had come to the WCW or soon after. And he had Thunder in Paradise, that show. It was a TNT
TBS,
show.
I think it was. Might have been TNT.
Yeah, TNT show, and all the WCW guys were on there. It was bad. Like it's just the gimmicks were just weak. The writing was weak. It didn't feel good. And yeah, seeing Shockmaster, and then for him to continue this buffoonery gimmick moving forward, I was like, man, they could have spun it like he got attacked from behind or something. They could have done that. They could have pulled the Dusty Rhodes came up again. Dusty Rhodes came up with this gimmick, and you're like, Dusty, and he's even gone on record back in the day. He's like, yeah, not every idea I came up with was good.
It's not all gold, baby.
No, and the fact that Ole Anderson was the guy doing the voice, and Ole Anderson was one of the original members of the Four Horsemen, is kind of a piece of shit, apparently. Like not a good guy. So I'm sure he was loving every minute of it. Because those guys, they were goofing on each other. They were goofing on each other all the time backstage. So I'm sure this was, he didn't live that down. I'm happy that Fred Ottman's still alive to this day, doing conventions, doing appearances, and he's just happy to do Tugboat, Typhoon, or Shockmaster.
Apparently, he brings the Shockmaster helmet with him, and that's what people kind of talk to him about. And he's A-okay with it. So I love that. Diallo, do you remember the Shockmaster?
No, I mean, I wasn't watching at that time regularly, so I didn't hear about it until like maybe the late 90s or early 2000s, but when it had become like internet lore. And, I've seen it over the years since then. I do have a hot take about it, though, actually.
Sure.
So, because, I mean, we obviously, like, I watched it. I was texting you guys. Like, I laughed for, like, 10 minutes straight. Just even when you were just talking about it now, I just started thinking about it.
I know.
I can't stop laughing.
Yeah.
It's so...
Because, I mean, when he goes down... He goes down so hard, and you can tell he's like, oh no. Not like these.
Yeah, like he's stumbling, the helmet falls.
And then it's all their reactions when you hear Ric Flair go, oh no. It's just like,
That's the best. That's the best part. One of the best parts.
But I have kind of a hot take, which is like the fall isn't like, because like he was set up to be like this person that was gonna take on Big Van Vader, but like he had a big ass glitter stormtrooper. Yeah. Like he was not like, even if he hadn't have fallen, he wasn't like intimidating or scary. He looked like a 70s disco thing.
Yeah.
And so he wouldn't have been, yeah. He would have been a laughing stock anyway, in my opinion, just not to the degree that he became. So that's my little hot take. Like if he hadn't, the falling was like the icing cherry and everything off in the cake. But like look at that picture of the guy with the stormtrooper mask. Like, if he hadn't have fallen out, I wouldn't be like, oh man, like that guy's gonna destroy Big Van Vader. Like, you know, like come on.
Yeah, no, you're 100% correct. I mean, it's hilarious. Like he's got this sleeveless trench coat that's open, sort of.
It's like it's a fur coat. It's like a fur thing.
Yeah, because it's got kind of something happening, and it doesn't match the helmet. Because then you're like, why is the helmet? First off, why is it a stormtrooper helmet?
Right.
Second off, why is it completely painted glitter? You know.
Well, and on top of that too, so Big Van Vader, when he was in Japan, he had this massive cool ass helmet
big thing
that
and
had
steam
coming out of it, and when he came to WCW or NWA at the time, I forget, he would there was a big big show that he would bring he'd come down to the ring with the helmet on. He'd take it off. You'd see the steam coming out of it. But when he took his helmet off, he kind of looked like a guy with a dominatrix mask on, you know?
Yeah,
and
I remember
Bane.
that. Yeah,
He looked like Bane.
like a panty, like almost like he had a women's panty on his head, and it was not as intimidating as he was when he had the helmet on. And I'm sure they were kind of trying to go for a similar gimmick of like, oh, this is gonna look so cool, but obviously they failed.
Holy shit! I mean, while you're talking, I googled. If you Google Big Van Vader, like the second one down, his helmet. He looks like something out of fucking Air Raiders or something. Like
it's badass.
It's insane.
He actually wears it on the pay-per-view that we watched. So he actually does it. He comes down the aisle and he takes off.
Yep.
The steam comes out and he takes it off. He puts it in front of him and then he like points to it and it's like this big spectacle and yeah.
But the funny thing is,
Against Stan Hansen, by the way. Stan Hansen's a
yeah.
legit badass too.
But the thing is, like, I know Big Van Vader from the weird gimp mask that he has underneath, not the metal one. The metal one's fucking awesome. Yeah, dude.
Well, that's the thing too. Japan knew what was up. Like they had gimmicks over there that really were fucking cool, and then it comes over here and it's like watered down and shit. So.
Well, growing up, my buddy Xair was a big Great Muta fan. So I've always been like sort of
legit.
Yeah, Great Muta's always sort of been not shoved down my throat, but like I know who he is and everything. Maybe next year we can cover Japanese wrestling or something like that. That'd be kind of cool. But yeah, that fucking Big Van Vader, infinitely fucking cooler than Shockmaster. And Diallo, to your point, I think, yeah, that's ultimately the thing. Like, even if he didn't fall flat on his face, it wouldn't have worked. Like, that gimmick is not going to work, period.
Yeah.
And the only way that it was ever going to be memorable is if he fell flat on his face. Like, that's how it was ever going to be memorable as the greatest intro gaff of all time, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
And the thing is, if Hulk Hogan just fell on his face, it would have just disappeared. But it's the fact that he looked like that and still fell on his face.
It's so it's like you would think that he was acting in a certain sense. Like it's like if you were to pretend I was falling, I would act like that. And then
yeah,
you know what I mean? But then at the very end the helmet falls off and he's like shuffling. You're like, no, he did not. He did not do that on purpose.
All I could think of, and I know I sent the GIF to you guys, but all I could think of was The Matrix when that one chick in white, she's like, not like these. Not like these.
Yeah.
Not like these.
Oh, man.
It's so good.
I love doing these wrestling shows with you guys. I know it's a yearly thing, but at this point, I kind of look forward to it. And this is my biggest outlet to talk about wrestling is this yearly event on TV Obscura. So I absolutely enjoyed it. My thoughts on the two matches, because Shockmaster doesn't really count.
It's a match in itself.
I enjoyed them both. I enjoyed them both for different reasons, different nostalgia. Like I have different nostalgia for WWF that I have for WCW. I had a good friend growing up, Robbie. He was a big Sting fan, so like if I hung out with him, I'd watch WCW. If I hung out with Luke, I'd watch WWF. So it was kind of nice seeing both. You know, and they weren't necessarily from the same era, but they were close enough that you could see the differences of the two, and especially in presentation and all that kind of stuff. And, you know, I think that there's a lot of awesomeness at WCW, but at the same time, I think I think it's obvious as to why Vince McMahon won, you know? Like, we're watching WCW matches on Peacock because WWE owns it, you know? Like, Vince won. That's bottom line, you know? But both of those matches had things in it that I loved and I was surprised by as someone watching in the year 2023, which just kind of goes to show that, you know, physical prowess, like stories aside and, you know, all this kind of stuff, the art of wrestling, like just the idea of these physical guys and gals, you know, doing their thing. And, you know, like, you know, you watch it and you can just, and you know the backstory, and you know that like they're helping each other, and the one guy that's getting slammed is also trying to make the other guy look good, and the other guy who's slamming him is also trying to protect him so he doesn't hurt himself. Like that's the shit that I love, and it's like a fucking dance, and it's awesome. I'll, you know, never move forward and become a wrestling guy, but I like where I live in the wrestling world. I like my little spaces that I inhabit because I like to be able to talk to them about it with you guys and everything. But Diallo, any final thoughts on the two matches and Shockmaster?
Yeah, I mean, that era of the WWF, that 87 to like 89, to me is sort of like peak WWF in terms of like where it was turning from a startup to like it was blowing up. That first time it blew up, you know. And there was a lot of magic and memorable stuff that happened then, and you know, the repercussions are felt today still. Again, the WCW stuff, like, again, as much as I went in on it, I voluntarily watched. I was like, I'm watching this whole thing because I wanted to, like, I used to watch those wrestlers, so I wanted to watch it, you know, and it was great to like see, like, again, people that I kind of forgotten about, and like saw where people, like, the phase that they were in between when I used to watch them to where I picked up again, so I saw what they were doing in the middle. Yeah, it was good times, good fun, and, you know, like Shockmaster.
He's shocking.
Yeah, like, it's just so. I remember, I mean, when I found out years later, I was like, oh, that was Tugboat, because I remember Tugboat, you know, and Tsunami or whatever it was. So I was like, oh,
Typhoon.
Yeah, Typhoon. I was like, oh, that's that guy. That's crazy, you know.
That's crazy. He went straight down. He went straight down. Zach, what? Any final thoughts on all of these?
Well, it's so interesting to see like where gimmicks go, whether they fail or whether they work or not. And I miss the era of us not knowing what was going on behind the curtain, whether it was good or bad. Now we know everything that goes on behind the curtain, and it's just like with celebrities now. It's like, well, there was a time when we didn't know all this shit, and it actually made it a little bit more enjoyable. I love my late 80s, slightly early 90s of NWA right before they made the turn to WCW, and knowing that they made the turn right at the same year that Flair chopped his hair off, it's really interesting. Like, that's a whole other discussion that we could save for another time. But yeah, it's all magic, man. Like, even sometimes the magic is a spark and explosion like Macho and Hogan, and sometimes it's a crash and burn like Shockmaster. and then you see the brutality. Like, the bottom line is whether these matches work or don't, these guys are beating the hell out of each other. And I remember watching the War Games match with Bodie, and I'm like, you do like they are, even though there is an outcome to this that is scripted, they are still really beating each other up legitimately. They're hitting each other hard. So the brutality of that match is a reminder of like kind of what I love about wrestling. It's like, my God, this is human cockfighting. And there's something very appealing to me about that, because it's like, because they're also, it's not MMA. They're like creating a storyline in there too. These are guys afterwards that might get a beer together, or in the case of Arn and Sid, go stab each other in the chest. So, it's just it's an era that sadly is gone, but fortunately, WWE is still around to put it out there for all of us to see. And also, fortunately, you've got a guy like Triple H, Hunter Hearst Helmsley, who's basically running a big part of the creative now instead of Vince McMahon. And Vince McMahon getting forced out. If you're interested, look that up. I'm glad he was. He deserves to be forced out. He's done. Like he forced all these other guys to close their doors and had really talented people suddenly out of a job. And he's inching his way back. He always finds a way to get back in. But man, it's just interesting that I actually started watching wrestling again fairly recently once Vince McMahon left. And that says something. Says something like maybe there's a new era that's coming back, because Triple H is a big fan of the NWA style. In fact, he brought the War Games back to NXT, their farm brand, and they had the War Games earlier this year or last year. Anyways, a variation on it. So I'm glad we talk about this stuff. I'm glad we got back into it again, and I can't wait to do it again next year.
Next year, I think, like we said, this is an annual thing. We do it around WrestleMania, and I think by the time we're recording this, by the time this drops, WrestleMania will be coming out in about a couple weeks. Fairly
April 1st and 2nd.
Okay, so yeah, only about a couple weeks. That's because our next TV Obscura would be after it, and I'd always rather hype up than do afterwards. But yeah, guys, always love talking wrestling with you guys, even though I don't technically feel like I know a lot, but I think I can still sort of hold my own. One place that I probably could actually hold my own, but I certainly don't know as much as Diallo. Buddy, the podcast you were always meant to do, Galactica, actually. Tell us about that one, buddy. What's going on over there?
So Galactica, actually, my co-host Jamie Smith, we're just each week we're going over an episode, in order of the reimagined Battlestar Galactica. I was a fan of the original show, so I add a lot of like my memories about that and context to some episodes, the reimagining that's happening in the moment. And then doing that, and then also finally put out the first re-recorded episode of the first Noel that I've been re-recording with the production studio in El Segundo, and going in to record chapter 2 tomorrow. So we'll have more of that coming out.
Awesome.
And have my my big debut project that's going to be coming out hopefully soon. We can talk about that a little bit more. That's what I'm doing.
Big things happen with Angela in the Dark very soon. Very, very excited.
So many good
for
things.
That. Yeah.
So many good things.
Zach, let's see. We are nearing the end of March. So you guys are wrapping up Martial Arts Madness. I know you've been plugging that, but what do you have going on in April on $2 late fee?
We're discussing. We've got an upcoming interview with Robert Rustler from Weird Science and Thrashin'.
And Vamp.
And Vamp, of course, Vamp. We'll be talking about the movie Thrashin' on $2 late fee and its killer soundtrack. It's underrated soundtrack. And then on the Patreon, we've got a great $2 6 question with Robert Rustler. Again, interactive stuff with patrons, trivia contests, get to come on the show. Tales from the Video Store is always hot. I've got a upcoming project that I'm working on, which once it's recorded and I'll drop it, then I'll talk about it. But until then, I'll just tease that it's another fun $2 late fee extension. Extension.
Kind of like how the Carpenter Factor is an extension of Podcasting After Dark.
Yeah, this is more in the lines of TV Obscura adjacent.
Okay.
So
Okay.
Something on the free feed to look forward to, which will probably carry over into the Patreon too. Well, there's lots to come on the Patreon.
Doesn't it always? I mean, ultimately,
It does. It does. The three of us will have to do another Patreon feed of like specific episodes of certain shows. I'm sure that's going to come down the pipe on Patreon.
Yeah, exactly. But right now, let's see. This month, we're going to be dropping our memoirs of an Invisible Man.
Oh, baby.
That Zach and I already recorded. It's a fun episode. It's a great discussion. And then next month on the Carpenter Factor, we will be talking about body bags. So I'm looking forward to discussing that as well. And then right around the corner, I think right after that, we have In the Mouth of Madness, which is the movie that I've been probably most looking forward to reviewing, because it's the third of the Apocalypse trilogy, and it's also one of the few Carpenter movies that I haven't seen. So I'm excited to check that one out. And got great shit going on over on the Patreon page. As always, every show has a Patreon page, and every show has a way to review it on Apple Podcasts. So if you're a fan of $2 Late Fee, if you're a fan of Galactica Actually, if you're a fan of Podcasting After Dark, a free way to help every show, every podcast that you listen to, doesn't matter if it's ours or the ones we mentioned, leave them a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Those really go a long way in helping out the shows that you enjoy. So if you listen to podcasts, leave them a 5-star review. It helps everybody. Spread the love.
Check us out. Spread it. Love it. Galactic it.
And as always,
Catch you in public, if you will, on the obscure side. Oh, yeah.
Be sure to subscribe to Podcasting After Dark and give us a 5-star rating on iTunes. Support Podcasting After Dark on Patreon. Follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Podcasting After Dark. And visit us next time for another installment of Podcasting After Dark with Corey Stevenson and Zach Schaefer.